on the situation here and bring us back to the issue and that terrorism is clearly more important and a greater threat to the United States than the supposed Islamophobia, which apparently is rampant on this side over here. So let me do a little refutation, and I want to provide some extension and kind of crystallize our side over here and make sure we tie up some loose ends. Now, the last speaker came up here and told us that terrorism is a random act, therefore it's a greater threat. But just because it's a random act doesn't mean that it's not a greater threat, because clearly it is, right? She used the quote next that like 1 in 80,000 people are, likely, victims of terrorism, and we think that's a great statistic, because then they go on and talk about Islamophobia is a greater threat because you're more likely to be oppressed in society, you're more likely. There's no basis for what they're saying, right? Because we come up here and say the idea that you might get on a plane and be bombed from a terrorist, right? That a terrorist might have a bomb on the plane, or when you go out in public and a person with a bomb on their chest blows themselves up. We think that you can actually understand that because it's happened, right? So they come up here and give you these ideas about Islamophobia, right? And saying that it's destroying society, but there's no evidence behind that. I will give you a list of terrorist attacks that have happened, and we think that that will sway the side to you. Right? So they talk about this quality of life, this supposed people always fearing, but we don't have any evidence. We don't have any names of these people that are in fear. And then they refuse the example that we had that actually hate crimes towards Islamophobia is really low. And they say, well, maybe people aren't, reporting that. Well, in criminology, as you might have heard in statistics classes, you can quantify the percentage of people that underreport, right? So we know, we gave you statistics, and the FBI can quantify maybe it's twice that, or maybe it's 50% more than that. So we think clearly we've showed you that it's really small, and statistically you can estimate that. But this idea of just because they're freaking out over here, it's just crazy. And then she talks about stress, isolation, and fear. Those are all things that happen because of terrorism, right? Not because of Islamophobia, right? She talks about getting on a plane and being afraid of, being all of these things. But that happens because you're afraid of being bombed, right? And that's terrorism, which is why terrorism is worse. And then she said, this is unacknowledged problem. The U.S. government isn't doing anything on it. And I'm going to talk about that in my extension about cultural exchanges. So we clearly think just because they're over here freaking out and yelling and saying that there's all these things, they have no evidence and no grounds, right? Because clearly this supposed problem, just because they say it isn't so. So I'm going to talk about how fixing terrorism by fighting it will actually keep the status quo, keeping us safe, and how Islamophobia isn't a problem to the extent that they have, and then how I'm going to be able to solve both issues through this. But let me just give you a list of things, right? So our weight over here, about what judge us around, is about how many deaths there's been, right? Because clearly you can quantify and see the deaths that have been caused by terrorism or why we need to fight terrorism, then you'll know that that's more important. So let me just give you a list, right? So 1993 World Trade Center, when they first tried to bomb the building. The embassy bombings in Kenya, where they tried to bomb the United States embassies. The United States, the USS Cole, which is a ship that they drove a boat into and blew up soldiers. The Beirut bombing, where 100-something Marines were bombed. Right, the LA airport in 1999, when a terrorist tried to drive by the Canadian border and bomb the LA airport. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, who tried to blow up an airplane while flying, was from the Middle East. The panty bomber, a couple Christmases ago. Right? And then Spain, Madrid, when they tried to bomb the trains there, and the UK when they tried to bomb the airport. Actually, they did bomb the airport. Thankfully, they didn't kill anybody. The DC sniper, where a man went out and started shooting people because he had a vengeance. The Bali hotel bombing. And then recently, as 2 weeks ago, the UPS boxes that they were flying from Dubai and trying to bomb airplanes. Thankfully, we caught that. So I've just given you a long list of actual cases where people have been murdered or almost murdered that is way more important than their supposed harms about the supposed fear that we haven't heard any news reports about, that we haven't heard any racist statements said. We think that's clearly more important. So if we continue to fight these things and stop actual people from dying, we think that we can solve that problem. Right? So we think by fixing the terrorists, fighting the terrorism, which we're doing in the status quo ever since 9/11, when we kind of woke up and realized that this is an issue, but we can do that. And then let me show you kind of the extension about how to solve both issues, right? Because we're really fighting the war on terror since 2001. Now, but we can solve both issues with our plan too, right? But we think it's more important to do our plan right? Because you have to keep people alive first. We clearly said that on this side, and they apparently think that there's no like evil in the world that they don't worry about, right? They only think that these supposed like biased, ignorant people are like the only things that are happening in society, which we haven't heard these people. Like we don't know who they are. Like, and even if there are a few, then they're not the ones out there blowing people up. So like we think like in Afghanistan and Iraq, like our global policy, like President Obama, is kind of like collaborative and like going out to the rest of the world and like trying to seek dialogue and understanding. Dialogue and understanding is how we're going to solve this, right? Because we think that like you can create peace through like cultural exchanges or kind of like developing and understanding people in other ways. And so we really think that we can solve these kind of things through every other way that we've done it. Like cultural understanding, getting to know these people, and if there's a supposed fear, we can dumb that down. But if we're dead, we can't. So thank you for voting with us today.